I've been working at the House of David for, I'll say, about a little over, almost quite a year and a half. As part of my doctoral studies, I had assistantship at a museum in St. Joseph, the Heritage. And that was kind of my introduction to the history of the House of David, because I'm from Kalamazoo, so it's not really, St. Joseph history is not, in Benton Harbor, it's not what I'm most familiar with. Other than, I collect a lot of old postcards. When I go to postcard shows, I always saw lots of House of David postcards for sale, so I knew it was a thing, but I really didn't know much more beyond that. But at the Heritage, a couple of years ago, we put together an exhibit on local sports history, and I was given the task of doing the section of the exhibit on the House of David and their baseball team, which I found was, a really amazing story. And I started to read all the books that we had in our research library on the House of David, and little did I know that, like a year later when I was done with that job at the museum, that someone told the House of David about me, and they scooped me up for some archival work that they had to do. So I went from St. Joseph to Benton Harbor, and what I'm going to be talking about today is generally an overview of both the history of the colony, as well as kind of showing off some of the, particularly the photographs that I've been working with in our collection. And you're going to see a lot of the photographs going to be showing, such as this one, are these beautiful Kodachrome lantern slides, which we've figured out for about 1941, and they're beautiful because they show color photography from that time period is pretty rare, and they look absolutely like they were taken yesterday. But we have photographs basically from the entire time range of the colony. This talk was also originally prepared for I gave it to a group that's interested in the Shakers, which is a communal society that's primarily based in the Northeast. So a lot of this talk is structured in terms of comparison to the Shakers. I'll try to remember to leave that out, but I may mention them occasionally. Just be warned. I'm going to try to get the faith aspects out of the way first, because that's probably the part that I'm least comfortable with, since a lot of the text that they've left is way over my head, like it's trying to read a foreign language. But the House of David is, it's a communal religious colony that's based on the Israelite faith, which is a millennialist faith, which basically they believe in the imminent arrival, Christ's second coming and his 1,000-year reign on earth. And it's a tradition that begins in England in the late 1700s with Joanna Southcott, who claimed to be the first of 7 messengers that are foretold in the book of Revelation. And the names here are basically from Joanna Southcott, the first messenger, down to James Jezreel, who was the 6th messenger, at least that's accepted in the Israelite faith today. Now, James Jezreel writes the book The Flying Roll, which is the book that catches Benjamin Purnell's eye, who's going to be the one that starts the House of David and claims that he is the 7th messenger, or the Shiloh, as was predicted by Joanna Southcott. And here we have Benjamin and Mary Purnell. Benjamin was born in 1861 in Kentucky and spent, the first part of his life, kind of running odd jobs, running around until he comes across the Flying Roll, and then he gets himself involved in the Israelite faith. And about in the 1890s is when he comes across this, and then shortly thereafter, he had spent some time in Detroit with a colony there. That he decided, had the revelation that he was the 7th messenger and began to seek converts along with his wife. And they're going to have, a very rocky start. They first go to Fostoria, Ohio, where they are essentially, their attempt to set up a colony there and get their group going isn't successful because, as luck would have it, they had 2 children, and their daughter, Hetty, was killed in a fireworks explosion, factory explosion. And because of the faith, they have difficulty, dealing with death, because one of the aspects of their faith is they believe that the body has eternal life as well as the soul. So if you're true to the faith, physically your body does not die. And the story goes, the town folks in Fostoria were enraged that Benjamin did not go to the funeral for his daughter. And on some accounts that they're run out of town, other accounts probably more likely is that just because the climate was not favorable, they say we'd be better off going elsewhere. But here's some of the other points of the faith. Like I said, they believe that the second coming is imminent, and they believe that there's going to be this, what they call the ingathering of the 12 tribes of Israel, which is, now the numbers vary. It's either 144,000 people are going to be at this ingathering, or it refers to couples, so it'll be 288,000. And the ingathering is going to be in Benton Harbor, where they go from Fostoria. They're probably, really well known for being celibate, being vegetarians, and the fact that the men grow beards, because there's, these are all based on various references in the Bible, and the beard thing comes from Leviticus. Basically, they grow their hair long, and let their beards grow out. And I always thought it was, the men were at a disadvantage because, the women can go into town and blend into the rest of the population, but the men, there was always obvious that they, who they were. Now the celibacy thing is, this was a major point I made in the talk about the Shakers, is the Shakers are notorious because they were celibate to the point where their buildings even were segregated. Like they had 2 front doors, 2 staircases, and the women sat on one side of the meeting house, the men on the other, and where it was never quite to that degree here. I mean, they didn't have 2 doors for each sex and all that stuff, and a lot of people they were still married when they joined the colony. It was when a couple came in, but they weren't expected to act as husband and wife anymore. And they even had, in the teens and the 20s, several mass group weddings. And the reasons for this, as I'm led to understand, is that whenever they'd get a large number of the members that were young adults, they decided, okay, it's best to pair them up to kind of protect their reputations, because otherwise the outside world is going to see all these unmarried single people living together in this little compound, what's going on. So as long as they're legally married, maybe that will dissuade some of that that talk. Now, well, they did get legally married in these weddings. Again, they did not actually live as couples. They basically lived as brothers and sisters. And this photograph shows the wedding dinner for the first of these weddings in the basement of one of the colony buildings in Jerusalem, I think. Now, in the faith's early years, Benjamin and Mary both spent a lot of time on the road, basically as missionaries trying to gather converts. And then by the time that they get settled in Benton Harbor in 1903, they really focused their energies, in Benton Harbor. So they begin, sending others. They have, teams of missionaries that go throughout the country, spreading the faith. And a lot of the missionaries, see pictures of these, horse-drawn wagons, which is, when you're talking about, the early 19th century, that's what they had available to them. And basically they went off on their own for months at a time, spreading the word. Benjamin and Mary's the last missionary trip that they went on was probably by far the most significant of any of the missionary trips. They went to Australia in 1904 to basically try to bring over the converts, or the members of the Fifth Church. So there was a large congregation of followers of James Rowe, which is the fifth messenger, still in Australia. So they go down there, and lucky for them, there was a prophecy that the seventh messenger was going to come from the New World, so they had that going for them. But they were able, make a convincing case so much that 85 members of that church, including most of the leadership, joined them to come back to Benton Harbor in 1905. They sailed to the United States, and then they all came in these train cars, And it was a kind of, it was a really big event where you have, this mass group of Israelites show up at the train station, and they marched, it's 2 or 3 miles from the train station, which was in downtown Benton Harbor, down to the colony. And one of the more other interesting missionary trips was this one, where you have a group of missionaries that took this boat. And this is a postcard that was published by actually by the House of David, even though it also looks like it's more of an ad for the manufacturer of the motor for the boat. But they sailed down the Mississippi River, down to the Gulf of Mexico, and then back up the Atlantic coast for thousands of miles, preaching along the way. And this is George and Lily McGregor, who were some missionaries that were based in Australia, and they spent much of their lives doing missionary work throughout Australia and New Zealand. And for the teens and the 20s, they sent several people, forwarded them on to Benton Harbor. Basically, you have people coming to Benton Harbor to join the House of David from all over the world. This is a lot of people from Australia, a lot of people from England, Scotland, other parts of Europe, as well as throughout the United States. And one of the things that I wish if I could go back in time to experience what it would have been like to have been there at the time, I really would have loved to have heard, all the chorus of accents that you would have heard at the time. You don't really, you don't think about that when you're looking at, black and white photographs of groups of people, but these people are from all these different parts of the world that all would have sounded, pretty different. And one of the, members that's still around today is actually from Scotland, so you can still get a little bit of that, but not quite what it was. Now, when they come to Benton Harbor, and what really the main thing that brings them to Benton Harbor is that there was a family that basically joined the church that was very wealthy, that was already established here, like they had a wagon company and owned a lot of land. So basically, they had, the resources were kind of in place, that Benton Harbor was economically and advantageous. And they decided to set up shop a few miles from the city itself at the time where, the House of David colony grounds is today was, was pretty remote at the time. So, okay, we'll be just outside of town. We'll, we won't have as much problem with the town folk that we had in Fostoria. And we'll have, room to expand and grow for the eventual ingathering. So they start to build buildings. The first building is this one called the Ark. And when it was first built, it was kind of like a jack of all trades. They had people lived in it. They had the print shop so they can print their religious literature. And later on, it became, it's housed the school for, you had a lot of families coming in with children, so they had to be educated. And I'm told that towards the end, it was kind of the housing for the misfits that didn't get along with anybody else. So if you, didn't fit in, you got sent off to live in the Ark, because the Ark was actually, a few blocks away from where everything else ended up being built. The second building they built, which is in the middle here, was called Bethlehem, which is a significantly larger building, but still, fairly simple, an L-shaped 3-story structure that was, entirely, basically, bedrooms. And this was built in 1904. Now, the rooms themselves, based on, Bethlehem has been gone since it fell down in 1998, so I've never seen it. And we actually don't have really any photographs of the interior of it, but from what I'm told, it was fairly comfortable, but not very elaborate. And you'd have, up to 4 or more people living in a room, because, they had, more and more people coming than they could possibly house. So it'd be quite some time before people begin to have the luxury of having rooms to themselves. Now, in this photograph to the right, right of Bethlehem, you see Jerusalem, which was the follow-up building, which is a little bit larger mirror image. Here's a closer up shot of Jerusalem. Now, Jerusalem was, a little, it's bigger than Bethlehem. It was a little bit more fancy. The interior had on the ground floor, 2 large, public spaces initially. And the top 2 levels were all bedrooms. And of course, this beautiful 2-level, porch wrapping around it. And Jerusalem's still there. It's, a little derelict, but walking through it, you can see, there's a lot of beautiful woodwork in it, and it was, a nice building. But again, you would have had, multiple people sharing, bedrooms. This is, one of those, the ground floor spaces in Jerusalem called the parlor. And that room is actually, still there today, and it's still, other than like the ornate stenciling along the walls, it's still pretty much looks like this. It's just got a lot of musty old furniture in it, so it's kind of hard to walk around. Now, the two buildings were joined by this archway, and I guess I probably should have picked a better picture because this one there's too many plants in front of it, but there's actually 3 arches. 2 smaller ones on the sides and the central arch. And this was symbolic. You see arches will figure a lot in Israelite architecture. And these 3 arches symbolize the merging of the 5th and 6th churches to create the 7th. And the arch is still there even though Bethlehem is gone, but it's going to be dismantled and sent to the Eden Springs Park, which is the old amusement park, and become I believe their new entrance. Now, after Bethlehem and Jerusalem are built, the architecture becomes significantly more elaborate and fanciful. So the next building is called Shiloh, which is going to be the main administration headquarters. And you can see this is more of a Queen Anne, more castle-like building than what the other 2 structures were. And this is in part due to, by this point, one of the members that came from Australia was William Wright, who was an architect, and he becomes the architect for a lot of the later buildings. And so, this is some of his influence. You also think something that's notable about it is, well, the other 2 buildings were wood. This one's made out of cinder block, or concrete block that the Israelites made themselves. And pretty much almost all the buildings after this are going to be made out of concrete block. But this is, again, although it's significantly more elaborate and the inside it's absolutely gorgeous, it's just like Bethlehem and Jerusalem, where it's a lot of bedrooms and where multiple people would have been housed. And even that a few years later they add another wing to it. The original part of Shiloh is on the left. This is taken from the back side, and then the part on the right is called the new house. And they're joined together by an archway and then a 2-story bridge. Now you can see in the foreground there's like a little tennis court. And one of the things I like to point out about a lot of the photographs you see of the colony grounds is you can play a game of Where's Benjamin, because he's in most of them. And you can usually tell by his little white hat. There's Benjamin there, and I think it's Mary behind him. So it's, see if you can find Benjamin in any of the other photographs as I'm going through the talk. Now the last of the major houses that they built is actually across Britain Avenue, south of where the rest of the buildings are. It's called the Diamond House, and it was completed in 1921. Now this one, all the other buildings had biblical names. The Diamond House gets its name because at this point they got the idea of adding a mineral called hematite into the concrete, which gives the concrete kind of a sparkly effect in the sun. And the Diamond House had this hematite concrete, but not only in the outside, but also the interior stairwell. So it's, on the right day, it's a really cool effect. The other thing I like to mention about this building is it looks really big on the outside, and the architecture is all really grand. But when you're actually inside of it, it's not that big. And like the stairwells, like the railings are really low, and like this is more of a tripping hazard than anything else. But still, it's a beautiful building too. And here's I like this photograph because it's an aerial view, and you can see there's some of the workers. The building's still under construction at this point, but some of the workers are standing on the porch on the back of the building. And like, they added some annexes to Shiloh. They also added an annex to the Diamond House, which is actually, also really small. But, the top floor of the annexes was Benjamin's final, his bedroom or living space. And I've been told that, part of the reason why, the Diamond House and its annex is kind of, off on its own is at this point, everybody wanted part of Benjamin's time, and the only way he could, get any kind of time to do his work or, any peace and quiet was, if he, at this point, lived further away from the rest of the colony. Now, probably what the colony is most known for are two things. One is the amusement park, Eden Springs, and this next thing is the baseball team. Now, Eden Springs, it's, when I first heard about it, it seems like, really bizarre. Why would a, religious colony run an amusement park? I mean, knowing what I know about the Shakers, like that seems like the last thing they would ever think about doing. But when you understand, how it developed and, the business reasons behind it, it ends up making sense. For starters, the property where, they start to build on where, Shiloh, Bethlehem, and Jerusalem are. South of that, there was already a little resort called Eastman Springs, which is what's going to become Eden Springs Park. And that had been there for quite some time because there were some spring waters, and basically, people from around the area as well as Chicago like to go there. That combined with the fact that you have a, religious group that has, an unusual lifestyle, at least from the perspective of the rest of the world, they're going to become a tourist attraction whether they like it or not. And people were coming to the colony basically uninvited, roaming around, poking their, trying to look in through the windows just, to see the, famous House of David people and their beards. So it's like, well, if we can't fight them, we might as well make some money off of them and, start, charging admission or, trying to sell them, ice cream and popcorn, that sort of thing. So now this photograph shows, I think this is probably the harbor in St. Joseph where, they have the big advertising sign. A lot of the people that would come to the park came from Chicago and came across the lake in steamships, which, here's a much later photograph, but here it shows one of the steamships that would have brought people over. And the House of David had, a fleet of buses that they got from the World's Fair ready to, take the passengers and drive them over to the park. They also had parking facilities available, basically the front lawn of the Diamond House. Or so, they were catering to, if you wanted to come, by train, by boat, by car, come to the House of David and we'll even give you free parking because they were going to make their money off of, again, train rides, popcorn, ice cream, and entertainment. The earliest version of the park was actually located directly behind Bethlehem and Jerusalem. They built this circular building, which was an aviary for exotic birds. They also had, you can kind of see it off, right behind it, there was a ice cream parlor. And this was, how it started, where it was basically, right in the middle of where the colony was trying to live and work. But then at the same time, the Eastman Springs property became available for sale. So the colony bought the property with the idea that not only would the property be, useful for further expansion as the colony's needs grew, then you needed land to build upon, but then they could, just divert all the amusement activities down to where this established park was. Yeah, but that's its own, it's a separate thing. Yeah, the Silver Beach was right on the lake shore and where the pier is. So. But the idea is, now all the visitors that would come and see the House of David and see the park, they'd no longer be, where the houses were, where the people are living, are working, and provided a nice sense of segregation. Now, probably, the thing that people most remember about the park was the trains. In 1908, when the park opens, the colony bought a little miniature locomotive and then immediately went about building more, and they had a loop of track that ran around the whole place. Basically, the setup was that they had a depot on Britton Avenue that would take you down into the park over a trestle bridge, because most of the park was actually in a ravine. You go over this trestle bridge to the South Depot, which was the park depot, and then you could take a train from that depot back across another trestle bridge back to Britton Avenue to leave. Now, one of the things I really enjoy looking at the old photographs of the amusement park, but it's also challenging too, because particularly in the early, first, 10, 20 years, it changed a lot. Like, I swear, like every season they were adding new things, or they're having to fix and modify things, or things are moving around. There's like this one double-decker gazebo that I'm pretty sure was in at least 3 different spots, because they kept moving it. Like in one photograph, it's in front of one building, then it's in a completely different part of the park, and it's like, okay, that's the exact same gazebo, but what is going on? But as you spend enough time, you can try to make some sense of it. Here's that was a previous image, was obviously a early photograph of the train. This one's much later, from the 40s, but shows the train going over one of the trestle bridges. And here's the initial the roundhouse with a lot of the young men and that would have worked on the locomotives. You can see all the locomotives behind them. Basically, it must have been a Herculean task keeping these things in operation, and they had to like basically overhaul them every season, and they did all the work themselves. So, but back particularly in the parks in early days, it was all colony labor, so it was all profit. All the people that worked in the park were members of the colony. Later on, it becomes more problematic as the membership starts to dwindle, and as membership gets older, they're having to hire more and more outside help, and that starts to affect their profit line. Because I forgot to mention, I'm told that about its peak, they had about 1,200 members, and this would have been about the First World War, and then it began a steady decline. By 1930, it was closer to 600 when they had their little split. It's another early view of the park. Actually, I think this is taken in the first year it opened. And the there's a big crowd, and you can see if you can spot Benjamin in it. But the building behind it was a building called the Archway, which the trains would travel through on their way from the North Depot into the park. And a couple of weeks ago, I found in the collection, some photographs of the park taken in the 1980s, and there were some pictures of this building all derelict with its windows, broken, and it was kind of sad. But it was, on the other hand, it was kind of cool to see that it actually survived so long. But that building's no longer there, unfortunately. This shows the depot that was located in the park. And this building is actually still there today, and is the depot that still functions. And you can point it, but this roof here is actually the grandstand for the ballpark, which I'll be talking about a little bit later. Again, I mentioned how every photograph of the park, it's kind of hard to date it because things kept changing. Well, this is a very early photograph, and this barn-like structure is I think the first incarnation of their vegetarian restaurant, which evolves into this building. Now, that earlier barn is basically buried in here. If you see like an elevated photograph, you can still see that barn-like roof. They just built all the stuff around it. And because the colony was vegetarian, the restaurant in the park was vegetarian, and it really amazes me to think that you're talking about the 1920s, 30s, 40s, how many vegetarians could there possibly have been? But the restaurant was actually very successful, and one of the things that people really are nostalgic about today. Here's a color interior view of the dining room, which probably is the center part of that early barn, and they added the side rooms later as the rest of the building was built around it. This is one of the earliest structures at the park. On the left, you can't see it, but the back of the building would have been the hill. That would have gone up to the top, and this is the buildings at the bottom of the hill, or bottom of the ravine. And at this point, it's being used as the beer garden. They wouldn't serve meat, but even though they're not supposed to drink alcohol, they had no problem serving alcohol, at least after Prohibition was over. And at this point, this is taken in the 1930s. Just outside of the photograph on the right would have been where the big open air stage was, where all the entertainment acts, so you can get your beer here and listen to the music or whatever was taking place on the stage. This building also is unfortunately no longer there. The park had a number of log cabins situated throughout it. I believe these are the ones that are on the south end by where the ballpark was. So I think these are the ones that are still there. Most of the log cabins were on the north end, and only one of those survives. One of the neat things about the early versions of the park is that they flooded the middle part of the ravine into an artificial lake. And here you can see that, and built over that is one of the early attractions, which was their bowling alleys and billiard halls. And they're credited to having, if not the first, one of the first automatic pin setting machines in the country. And the group of people that's standing on the roof is you can't really see them because they're too small in the picture, but that's the female band. And here's some interior shots of the bowling alley. I'm not quite sure what the game in the right photograph is. It looks like it's some kind of combination of bowling and billiards, but it's not something I'm familiar with, but something they had. The interior of the billiard hall, and you can see all these tables. And actually one of these tables we still have today and has been restored and is currently on the second floor of Shiloh, and there it is. And I work in the next room over, so whenever somebody uses it, I get annoyed because it's kind of distracting. But it's pretty cool that we actually still have one of those original over 100-year-old tables. The park was also really well known for its gardens, which maintaining those was basically a full-time job. And this is a nice photograph because the black and white photographs don't really do it justice because you can't really get the impact of all the flowers and other vegetation. But this beautiful color Kodachrome slide does a much better job. This shows the zoo area of the park, which they had monkey houses, bird house. They would add lions and other exotic animals. And they also had this large stone miniature house that was a popular attraction. And unfortunately, the house is no longer there, but it still exists. I know it's in somebody's private collection somewhere, but I don't remember exactly where it ended up off the top of my head. A later attraction at the park was this midget auto track. And it's one of the things that a lot of people, if they were kids when they went to the park, they probably really remember fondly. Because I'm sure if you were like 6 or 8 years old, being able to drive around in one of these cars was probably the most awesome thing ever. And that track is you can still see it today. The track's still there, and a lot of the cars are of it. You can see them at the park, but they don't drive them around the track anymore. Now, one of the things I found interesting about the House of David, especially as I said I did this talk earlier to a group interested in the Shakers, is that being a religious colony, they never really had a dedicated church building, which seems unusual. The closest thing they had was on the park property. They built initially an open-air amphitheater, and this is where if Benjamin had to do any kind of sermon or anything of that nature to a large group of either members or and or the public, this is where it would have taken place. And the first version is basically a very simple wooden set of benches built into the hillside, and it slowly evolves. And in this photograph, you can kind of see it in the background. There's like a little bit of a stage that they built up, a tint roof, and you can see under that tent, they're starting to lay the forms for concrete, seating. And then here's the concrete seating's, completed, and you can see there's a, some kind of probably an entertainment act taking place on the stage, or someone giving a talk. But at this point, it looks like it has a tent, erected over the top of it. And a few years later, they built this big, building, basically covering the whole thing. And looks like a big imposing, cinder block structure from the bottom of the hill, which is where we're seeing it. But if you saw it from the top of the hill, it looks like this is a big wooden shed. So they spent all their money on this facade. And you can see right in front of it, that double-decker gazebo that I mentioned earlier that I see in different locations and different photographs. And it was like, why the heck do they keep moving this thing? But at this point in time, it's directly in front of the auditorium. And in the 1930s, that auditorium was torn down, and they, when they built the new open-air stage in another location, and they transformed the old space into this, terrace fountain, but you can still very much see how that was a seating bowl at one point in time. And this fountain is still there. I guess, before they started doing any work on the park a few years ago, it was basically so overgrown you couldn't see it. But now, they've ripped away all the weeds, and it's still there and still functions. Say when they tore down the auditorium, this is the open-air stage that they built. And this is probably, if people, remember going to the park when they were younger, this is probably what they most remember, because, the other auditorium's been gone for, since the 30s. But after Benjamin died in 1927, and the colony was under the leadership of Judge Dewhirst, he began, an extensive overhaul of the entire park, and building this new stage was one of the major projects. Later on, towards the park's, last few years, they built a big metal roof that would have covered the seating area and really kind of obscured the beauty of the proscenium. And I'm told that that was, really a bad idea, not only because aesthetically it looked terrible, but because it trapped the winds and, it didn't do what they hoped it would do. Now, aside from the park, and one of the, things that the park really, gave them a venue for was, they were big into music. And I'm not going to talk a whole lot about their bands because I know there's a program coming up about, the House of David musicians. So I'm happy enough to, leave that for another day. But they did, a lot of the people that came from Australia particularly were very talented musicians, so that's one of the things that really got this going. But they were, Benjamin loved music, and it became not only an important aspect of the faith, but because the park gave them a natural venue to, entertain the crowds, it became, one of the biggest, activities for colony members. And there were, large bands, quartets, big and small over the years. They also had traveling bands that would on occasion travel for the baseball teams around the country. Here's some of the musicians standing in front of the arch. And I guess in this photograph, you can better see that, the two small arches on the side and the big arch in the middle. I know one of the gimmicks that at least the male bands like to do would, as the curtains lifted, they'd be facing away from the audience, showing off their long hair, and then they turn around, revealing that they were in fact men. And I guess that was like a big gag and amuse the audience. Here you see one of the female bands in some rather uncomfortable looking uniforms. So this one's a fairly early photograph. And here's a later version of the female band, though there's Bob Dewhirst in the middle, being the lone male member of the ladies' orchestra. When I get to baseball, which aside from the park baseball is what, is really the House of David is most famous for, especially on a national level, because the baseball team, our baseball teams, I should say, traveled all over the country, and is how most of the outside world would have had any sort of interaction with them. Now, kind of like the park again, it's like, gee, how does a religious, colony get into sports? Especially on, a level where they're, it's like a business for them. Well, the story begins in 1910 when the House of David builds this ballpark on the southeast corner of their, Eden Springs property for the use of a local semi-pro team called the Speed Boys. And since the park was there and the Speed Boys weren't, playing games there, all the time, the young men of the colony began, in the off time, start playing pickup games, and that kind of snowballed where they start to challenge, all their local teams, and that attracts attention, and crowds start to show up, and Benjamin realizes that he can start charging admission because the House of David ball players end up being really good. And he's also going to encourage it because he loves baseball. He loved to watch the games himself. He saw it as a wholesome activity. Athletics would be something that would, not only keep, the young men out of trouble, but, would be good for them. And it was also, foster good relations with the public. So really beginning in 1914, they start to actually formally organize baseball teams that start to challenge, local and industrial teams and teams from around the region on a more, formal level. And then that quickly expands. They start to have, at their peak, multiple teams going at the same time. They would have a home team that played, the games at the ballpark on the colony, but they'd also have, like traveling teams, usually 2 traveling teams going around the country at any one time. Actually peaking in the early 1930s when, as I'll get to, the colony divides in 2, and each group has its own traveling baseball teams. So you actually have multiple House of David teams going around the country. And then in addition to that, you have copycats, people that have no affiliation whatsoever with the House of David, but realize that it's an established brand and it's popular, so they set up their own fake House of David teams that are traveling around, and the colony does what they can to try to prevent that from happening, and they do sue a few people, but it's kind of hard to control everybody. Unfortunately, in terms of our collection at the colony, most of our baseball stuff walked away over the years. So when I showed up, there isn't a whole lot left. So I don't have a whole lot of photographs to throw in here, at least not as many as I'd like. This one shows the home team, and the man sitting in the middle is Francis Thorpe, who was actually not only a player, but he was the manager of the whole enterprise. And when the colony splits, Francis Thorpe, he goes to the new colony, the city of David, and takes most of the ball players with him. But there's 2 of the players we do have photographs of. The one on the left is Tom Dewhirst, who was the son of the leader of the colony after Benjamin, and he was nicknamed the Bearded Babe Ruth, and he was going to have a illustrious career. If the House of David not only is a ball player in his youth, but later on he's the president until he died, I think 96, something around there. And the individual on the right is Lloyd Dolliger, who was the last living member who had played on the teams. He actually passed away at the ripe old age of 99, 4 years ago about. And all the photographs we have of them in uniform, we don't have any of them actually in a House of David uniform. They're all in some other team's uniform. But that is actually the House of David ballpark in the background. So unfortunately, I didn't show up early enough where I could have asked him what the deal was. But I'm told he was, a really great guy and wonderful to talk to. anything else I want to mention about baseball before I move on. As I said, when the colony splits in 1930, most of the players will go to the new colony, the City of David. But the House of David will maintain, traveling teams up until about 1937, and then they'll maintain a home team into the 40s. Whereas the City of David, because they got most of the players, they had the advantage of being able to go on a little bit longer, and their teams played until through the 1955 season when George Anderson, the last colony member to play, retired. And at that point, it was a combination that there were fewer members that could play because they're all getting too old. So most of the team at this point were people they had hired. They hire some, good ball player and tell them, okay, grow a beard for next season, so you can pass off as a colony member. But and they had some pretty famous people that they actually hired. In the 30s, the House of David hired Grover Cleveland Alexander, who was at the very end of his career, and he's one of the most famous and best pitchers of all time. And he was one of the few people they did not make grow a beard, probably because there was like no way he would have done it. But they also, they were famous for playing, against, Satchel Page's, his traveling team. They played against other Negro teams, and as they barnstorm across the country. But as they got too old to do it, and by the 1950s, television is catching the people's attention, so fewer and fewer people are going to games. So by the time George Anderson retires, it's no longer profitable. So that was the end of that. Okay, so shifting gears quite a bit to High Island. Another thing they're known for various reasons, probably a little bit less positive reasons than the ball team. In 1908 or 10, something like that, they lease a large percentage of High Island for the lumbering rights. So they set up a lumbering camp up there, and that's where they are going to get a lot of their timber to build, the buildings and the colony grounds, to build the amusement park, and they also, are getting timber for, to sell. Here's a picture of the sawmill up there, and the colony made a kind of ill-fated attempt to running some boats to transport this lumber back and forth between the island back to Benton Harbor. And the first boat they had was a ship called the Rising Sun. They purchased this old steamer and ran it for a few seasons before that thing ran aground. But fortunately, nobody was lost in that accident. But the ship was destroyed. So then they had to buy a new ship. They bought a schooner called the Rosabelle, and that thing ran for a few years, and then that thing capsized and killing everybody on board. And after that accident, they okay, no more boats. But the lumber camp ran for a few more years, and then it kind of was one of the victims of when the colony split. Because basically, most of the people that were up on High Island were supporters of Mary and her new faction, so Judge Dewhirst kind of abandoned them there, and they had to make their own way back to Benton Harbor. Now, being up in the middle of Lake Michigan, fairly far north, High Island, of course, had very long, hard winters, and was in many respects could be seen as an unpopular assignment, because if you had to live up there year-round and have to deal with that kind of snow for much of the year. That's probably part of the reason why it's gained kind of an urban legend reputation as being the Siberia for the Gulag for the House of David, that if you displeased Benjamin in some way, that they would ship you up there as punishment. Although it's not exactly true. I'm sure not everybody that went up there was very thrilled with the prospect, but it also wasn't necessarily like a gulag. It was just, you work there, you work at a farm, you had to do something. Now, one of the more ambitious projects that was also a victim of the colony's troubles in the 20s and then the split in 1930 was this hotel that they were going to build in downtown Benton Harbor. They wanted to build a hotel in part to get some year-round income because, you know, the baseball teams and the park were seasonal, and a hotel, you know, could be something to be year-round. And they bought a bunch of property and had their, you know, architect draft up these, you know, plans for this enormous 7-story concrete building that was going to be covered in that, you know, sparkly hematite. But and they began construction, but then in the early 20s, the colony starts to have more and more legal trouble, where you have, for the most part, disgruntled former members that, you know, decide, you know, okay, they no longer want to be part of this, and they leave. And then when they leave, they want their money back because they had to give all their money to the colony when they joined, and they start to sue. And Benjamin, also at this time, is going into declining health, so he becomes kind of like isolated in the Diamond House, and building, you know, this massive project is no longer in the cards. So the tall 7-story section is eventually never built. The shorter, you know, section on the other end is as far as they got. And for basically from the mid-20s up until, you know, the early 30s, this is how it stood. You know, the ground floor, you know, they had some businesses in there, but the upper floors were never finished. And then when the colony, you know, splits and they divide up the assets, Mary and the city of David will get this hotel, and they'll finish it and, you know, finally get it opened. But, you know, the big, tall 7-story part, which would have been really cool, had been built, you know, never materializes. And you say, you know, because at this point we're getting the legal troubles, and here you see this photograph of Benjamin as he's being wheeled into the courthouse in 1927, and it shows at this point he's in really frail health. He's no longer, you know, the regal, you know, individual that you can spot in all the photographs of crowds, because he, you know, just really stands out. He's, you know, on his last legs. And, you know, the colony is being sued by people who, you know, basically they want their money back. There are, you know, people that are accusing Benjamin in particular of, you know, having inappropriate sexual relations with some of the younger female members. Again, most of these people are from people that have financial gain if the colony had been broken up, and people that are claiming that basically the House of David was, you know, a religious fraud and a public nuisance. And this goes to trial with the, you know, but and basically Benjamin is basically, you know, by law banished from the colony, but then he dies like shortly thereafter, and, you know, months later. So, I mean, the decision is ultimately kind of made moot, and then it's immediately overturned by the state Supreme Court. So, all this was a, you know, huge sensational episode that kind of ended up coming to nothing, but unfortunately, from Benjamin's perspective, you know, made his last few years really miserable. And contrary to popular opinion or, you know, legend, he was never actually tried or convicted for any, you know, sexual, you know, misconduct. That's something that, you know, is kind of lived on in urban legends and become, you know, far more, you know, snowballed, you know, the things that he's been accused of doing. But he was never actually, you know, tried for anything of that nature. He said when Benjamin passes away, you know, the leadership of the colony goes to Judge Dewhirst, who had joined the House of David in 1920, and he quickly rose, you know, amongst the leadership for, among other reasons, he was, you know, in the right place at the right time, because as a judge who knew a lot about the law and was very good at what he did, this is the House of David coming into legal trouble, you know, we can really use this guy. So this is him with his family and his, you know, sons Bob and, you know, Tom, who was the baseball player I already mentioned. Now, Dewhirst, he never takes, you know, any religious role. You know, once Benjamin's gone, you know, that's, you know, there's no more, you know, religious leader, but he's, you know, kind of the administrator. This does not sit well with Mary, who never really liked Dewhirst. and did not like that she's kind of be pushed to the side. And for, basically from Benjamin's death in 27 to 1930, there's like this really, bitter infighting taking place that leads to the colony splitting in half, with half of the people basically siding with Mary, who Mary is claiming that, she and Benjamin were jointly the seventh messenger. And she and her followers basically take, half of colony's assets and march 2 blocks down the street and found the House of David as reorganized by Mary Purnell, or as it's more commonly known, the City of David. And the rest of the colony stays on the old property, which is, run by Judge Dewhirst. And nowadays, a lot of people have don't really realize that, there's actually 2 separate groups, or where, there's actually a dividing line, because, the colonies are right next to each other, and they don't really know the history. But the fact is, there is a very real division, and it was a very bitter division, like families, split apart, and some people never, talk to, their friends or families again, because, they, went to either side. And from, the House of David perspective, people that accept Mary as a seventh messenger are kind of, it's a, a religious heresy. And, same thing from the City of David perspective, even though they're both, followers of the, same Israelite faith. From my, historical perspective, I think it's unfortunate the way, because Mary was, whether you accept her as a messenger or not, she was, fairly important in the early history of the House of David. So it's kind of, she hasn't been erased from the colony's memory, but she's certainly not really mentioned a lot. So after the split, the colony enters I say a kind of a second golden age. The membership is never going to, remotely come close to what it was in the early years. But this is the time period because Judge Dewhirst is, if nothing else, very good administrator and a businessman. And this is when they get some of their really, famous businesses going. As I said, at this point they rebuild the park. They have the baseball team still going. And even though they never build that cool 7-story hotel, they do, the building that they actually purchased intending to tear down, that's becomes the House of David Hotel, a little less glamorous than what was planned. But you can see behind it, the Mary's Fireproof Hotel, which was what ended up being built. So both colonies had their hotels running side by side. They did build a motel outside of St. Joseph along the lakefront called the Grande Vista, which is, a rather innovative and cool complex. It had, motor court units. It had a restaurant and a nightclub. And here you see Judge Dewhirst talking to some individual who I don't know who that is, but that's the restaurant building behind them. And there's a view of the motor courts, which all the rooms have their own little private garages, so you can park your car under a roof. And this complex was on either side of the street, so you can see some more of it in the background. There's the interior of the club room, so they could have entertainment acts, which was in addition to the House of David entertainers, they would have a lot of traveling entertainers and musicians that come through and play here. They also bought a motel down in Texas. I guess the only reason I can find why they did this is because Judge Dewhirst liked to go vacation down there. So, but this was a case where they bought an existing property. And Benton Harbor was really well known for its massive fruit market at the time. They had one of the largest fruit markets in the world. So the House of David built this large cold storage warehouse, which helped. It was profited off the fruit market, but it also helped the fruit market grow because gave some nice long-term storage for all the farmers. Here's an interior view of the cold storage warehouse. Lots and lots of some kind of fruit. They ran their own, basically food products. They had bakeries, which were, open to the public. They had, they had their farms, which they did their own. They had canning factories, which they took the produce from their farms and, could sell it in stores as well as, I believe, by mail order. Of course, it was everything strictly vegetarian. For a while, they had an automobile dealership in downtown Benton Harbor. And this building is actually still there. It's, it's one of the really big landmarks down there because of the big eagle on the roof. And I think it's a resale shop now, but at the time it was it was their car dealership. They had one of the members, Frank Rosetta, was a talented artist in making sculptures. So they had a art department that made like little kind of knickknacks and souvenirs to put in your home that they sold both at the amusement park. They sold at when they had a booth at the World's Fair in Chicago in 1933, and they also sold it through the mail. And one of the things that was really unique about the artwork was it's made out of plaster, but it was covered in a unique finish. It's kind of like a pearly ivory finish that I'm told the formula was something that Frank Rosetta came up with and took with him to his grave. So don't know exactly how it was made, but when you look at it, it looks like it's the sculpture is made from a giant pearl. And you can see they're applying the coating to some of the art pieces. Talk a little bit about some of the stuff that we have and I've been finding in our collection. And when I started, none of the stuff was really well organized. I basically walked into a room that had a massive mound of postcards that wasn't sorted at all, and I had to start getting things sorted by subject. But I've been finding obviously there's the postcards that the colony published and for sale to sell in their souvenir stands, but also a lot of like snapshots from the members' lives. Like here, the picture on the left shows that's Mary, her friend Cora Mooney sitting, and then Edith Meldrum sitting to the right of them. And I believe the girl in Mary's arms is Hetty, which has been their granddaughter. And this other photograph shows, I know it's Mabel Blackburn and her mother, and I'm guessing probably some family friends, on a little trip to the beach. So you see, our photographic collection ranges from more formal like studio portraits, or our professional photographs of buildings and of that nature, but also a lot of pictures that people are taking of their vacations and of their daily lives, which gives it a nice personal touch and it helps me feel a little bit connected to some of these people that I'm never going to meet because they died decades before I came along. But the photograph on the left here, this young boy on the swing, is William Robertson, who is actually still alive. He just turned 90 a few months ago, and he's still a member. So here's one person that I actually have met. And then the photograph on the right is a common thing that we have is the park had a little photo studio where visitors could get their pictures taken, and then when the negatives got developed, they would mail the prints out to you. And we have a lot of these showing the different visitors that came to the park over the years. And this one shows, I guess, probably around the time of the First World War. I think the flag says 1918, so it's probably some Army nurses or something along those lines. We have, some artifacts. The drum on the left there is, really cool. And then you see a lot of the band pictures, that shows the painted drums, but I haven't found a photograph that shows this one in it yet, unfortunately. But still, the drum's a cool artifact. As you can see, it says, the Israelite House of David Band and all that. The other photograph shows some of the art pieces that we still have in our collection on display in one of the display cases in Shiloh. And my boss Brian keeps buying more and more of the stuff from various places, so he's got like probably hundreds of pieces at this time, but never satisfied. You know, the buildings today, after for many decades after particularly from the 1960s onward, a lot of the houses started to deteriorate because they no longer really bothered to maintain them. As I mentioned earlier, Bethlehem basically finally fell down one day. So these photographs, these are the inside of Jerusalem. I showed you an old photograph of the parlor. This is the parlor today, where this photograph actually makes it look a little less cluttered than it really is. And it also makes it look like it's a lot brighter than it really is, because it's probably a 30-second exposure. It's really dark in there. But they cut the power, and Jerusalem's vacant. And here you see this was the front entryway with this beautiful carved staircase. You can see what I meant by some of the beautiful woodwork that was inside these buildings. And in this photograph, you can kind of see where something's been cut away. And there was originally a beautiful carved arch that would have been, led you into the building. And that doorway and that wall, when the building was first built, was not there because the ground floor was all open. But this archway would have been, this beautiful thing to greet you when you first walk in the building. And they removed that arch, actually a little while before I actually got hired. So I'm kind of miffed that I never actually got to see it in its original spot. But they've installed it in the stairway in Shiloh, which has been, for the past several years, they've been doing a lot of work on restoring. So this is, you can see that, archway as it is now. And actually, I would not have known that it was not always there had they not told me, this came from Jerusalem and was not originally in Shiloh. They did a fairly good job of integrating it. This is the staircase in Shiloh taken from the top floor. And you see, as I said, Shiloh's been beautifully restored, inside and out over the past several years. And it's being, people are asking, what they're doing all this work, what's going on, and the short answer is they're preparing for the millennium. They still believe that the ingathering is going to happen, so they're making buildings ready for people to live in. So all these, they're putting in new bathrooms and making all these rooms, in a livable condition. Because I guess a few years ago, I never saw what Shiloh looked like before they started doing the work, but I'm told it was really rough and almost uninhabitable. But I can tell you they've done a beautiful job. This is the staircase in the Diamond House. Just as you'd come in through the front door, you can see that concrete use in the columns and on the floor. And I took this picture last winter when the building they were still working on the building. They've since finished, and the family members of one of the members are living in there currently. But you can see it's somewhat different architecture, but still really fantastic. And you can't really tell from the photographs, but as I said, those railings are really low to the ground. Here's the staircase from the second floor, and on either side there's groups of bedrooms, and the bedroom that would be in the corner in the middle there has a cool walk-in bank vault in it, as well as the bridge that goes over to the annex. Now the park property was sold by the colony, I want to say 6 or 7 years ago, to a group that's been spending the years restoring it. When the park closed in the mid-70s, it was basically for the most part they just kind of walked away from a lot of the buildings, and a lot of it just kind of decayed back into nature. So they've been putting an awful lot of effort in, not only clearing away all the the jungle type growth that was there to reveal the buildings and structures that are still surviving, but they've also laid new railroad track. They've gotten some trains running. So on weekends in the summer, you can go to the park and walk around and see the grounds and ride the trains, and it's something I recommend if you're in the area. And I believe they do have some events coming up in the next month. I know they do like haunted Halloween train rides, and I think there's some flyers on the table there for it. But this shows the current appearance of the old restaurant building, where part of it's been unfortunately had to be taken down because it's too dilapidated, but they're hoping to preserve other parts of it. As you can see in the background, the Park Depot, as well as the old seat house, are still there in fairly good repair. I want to talk a little bit about, I mentioned, there's the scandals in the 1920s and how, that, kind of haunted Benjamin in his last days. Well, unfortunately, a lot of those stories have, lived on in large part due to this book that came out in 1960. And this is basically, kind of like a little trashy dime store novel that took all these accounts that they pulled from the newspapers in the 20s, magnified them times 10, and made, Benjamin out to be like a, sexually depraved, charlatan, and all the members of the colony to be, idiots, basically. And, unfortunately, I mean, I can, when I read the book, I can, it's kind of funny because it's so out there ridiculous, but it's sad because, this is what a lot of people, really base their idea of what the House of David is now, because for a long time this was actually the only book out there. Since then, there's been a book, the next book that came out was The Righteous Remnant, which is really the first, what I call work of scholarship on the House of David, but it's not a whole lot better. It's really this book with an academic kind of cover over it, because the author of that book pretty much took all the, the newspaper scandal articles for face value and didn't really look at any other side of the story. So it's a little more polite reading than this one, but it's still pretty much the same thesis that, Benjamin bad and, everybody else is dumb. The next book that came out by Claire Aiken called Brother Benjamin is really, I'd say it's the best book out there if you want to read, get the history of the colony. Because he does, a fairly, good balance. He doesn't try to hide anything, but he does, the best balanced view and best overall view of the colony's history. Ron Taylor at the City of David has come out with a number of publications. Some of I think a lot of them are limited runs, so they might be hard to get, but they're generally pretty good because Ron Taylor, being an Israelite himself, he's not going to make things up. He cares about the history. But his writings, coming from the House of David, I can tell there's the bias when it comes to the split and his views of Mary. And obviously, once the history gets up to 1930, it becomes the City of David history, and it doesn't talk about the House of David history so much. There's an excellent book from Arcadia Publishing on the baseball team that I'd highly recommend. It's very well researched, and it has all the photographs that I wish I could have had in this presentation, but decided the colony, we don't have very many of the baseball pitchers anymore. But again, that book is strictly about baseball, so you're not going to learn anything else about the colony history, but for being a baseball book, it's very well done. There's a great book on High Island written by somebody that actually grew up there, and I believe that's Island Life, Island Toil. It's a great book if you can find it. There's another Arcadia book that I would mention, but about the House of David, but it's, I can tell you that it's got a lot of things wrong in it. So I would not recommend that one. Like, there's things that are mislabeled and flat out, incorrect. So if you want to read more about it, get a copy of, Brother Benjamin or, the baseball book or the like. But that's largely the extent of the literature out there, which when I talked to the Shaker group, it's there's hundreds of books about the Shakers, but like a handful about the House of David.